Watch out, because today I'm going to start off as your ally and end up as your enemy. You've been warned. What's up, guys? My name's Brandon McNulty. I'm a writer, I'm the author of Bad Parts, and welcome to my writing channel. Today I want to talk about two very specific types of characters, the false friends and the false enemies. And these characters you should be using in your stories because they can pay off in some heavy emotional impact. In the case of false friends, we're talking about characters who start off looking like good guys or, friends of your main character, allies, something like that, and they end up betraying them in the end. Betrayal is the hallmark of these types of characters. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have the false enemies, and these types of characters usually start off seeming like they're going to be villains, or they're at the very least going to be working against your main character. But over the course of the story, they prove to be something more, and usually when that moment happens, there is a sense of uplift. Now, John Truby talks about these two types of characters in his book, The Anatomy of Story. He gives them a little more technical terminology. Instead of calling them the false friends, he calls them the false ally opponent, and instead of having the false enemies, he calls them the false opponent ally. But terminology aside, Truby suggests that these two types of characters make your stories more interesting and surprising, so naturally you want to include them if you can. Now I want to talk about each type in a little more detail. With the false friends that I mentioned, of course, they usually pay off in betrayal, and these kind of betrayal moments are great for building up your villains, especially if you're working on a series, and maybe in book one you start off with a character who looks like a hero, but toward the end they betray your main cast, and then later on in future books they end up as a more, definitive villain. That can be a great thing to do. Also, whenever you do have these betrayal moments, try and sync them up with some devastating setbacks in your story. If you're familiar with plot structure and you know about the all is lost moment, a betrayal is a great thing to include in that type of moment. Now, there are a lot of great examples of stories that include these false friends, but one of my favorite ones is the third Indiana Jones movie, The Last Crusade. And I like this one as an example because it includes not just one, but two false friends. And if you remember in The Last Crusade, the character of Elsa, she is Indy's love interest early on in the story. And it seems like, based on the typical structure of Indiana Jones movies, he's going to hook up with this girl, they're going to go on some adventures together, overcome some obstacles, and save the day in the end. But because we're kind of lulled into that system, we are shocked later on in the story when we find out that she is in fact a Nazi and she's working against him. Now, another character that we meet early on is Walter Donovan, and he appears to be somebody that Indy can trust. This guy is a collector of artifacts, he's knowledgeable about the subject, and he's the one who actually sends Indy's father on the quest to find the Grail. But later on, right after we learn that Elsa is with the Nazis, we learn that also Walter Donovan is with them as well, and that his initial intentions of wanting eternal life are much more sinister. Now, one thing to be aware of about these two false friends, Elsa and Walter, is that not only do they devastate Indiana Jones by betraying him, but these two characters also rise to become more interesting villains because of the fact that they start off seeming like allies. Imagine this movie if instead of Walter and Elsa being, these characters who betray Indy, instead of them being there as the villains later on, imagine if we're just, forced to learn about two new villains. That would take up time, explanations, things like that. There'd be backstory drawn out. We'd have things explained to us about, who this guy is, why he wants the Grail, and who this woman is, and why she's involved. But instead of this, we have this impactful moment where it's like, oh shit, we've just been betrayed by these people we thought we could trust. And now instead we have to make sense of their true motivations, and we're unpackaging things, and it's interesting, it's engaging. I would highly recommend, if you can, try and work into your story some type of character who starts off looking like an ally and then betrays them and ends up becoming the villain. Now, as for false enemies, these types of characters appear to be villains, or at least appear to be working against your hero. But, of course, it's just the opposite. They are actually on the side of your hero. One of the benefits of a false enemy character is that they could start off looking like a darker character, but once we get to actually root for them, we're left with a badass anti-hero, as opposed to like the squeaky clean good guy heroes. One of the things to be aware of, however, if you are trying to create an anti-hero like this, where they're initially portrayed as a villain, you gotta be careful. You don't want them to be too villainous at the start. You don't want them drowning babies in the first scene and then 2 scenes later it's like, oh yeah, by the way, here's an uplifting thing, this guy is actually on our side. It's not going to work like that. You can have them doing some morally gray stuff, but you don't want them doing irredeemable stuff. You want characters who you can eventually root for, not ones that you have to hate. A great example would be Terminator 2, and if you've seen the first Terminator movie, you're used to seeing Arnold Schwarzenegger running around killing people and trying to kill Sarah Connor. So at the start of Terminator 2, when he makes another appearance, and we get the sense that he's going after John Connor, we assume that, uh-oh, this guy is the villain, he's going to kill John Connor. But it's just the opposite, and he ends up instead protecting John Connor from the false friend who is the T-1000, the liquid metal machine. And this particular moment in Terminator 2 is a great example of having the false friend and the false enemy meeting at the same time and having a dual payoff in both betrayal and uplift. It's very exciting, and it's a very effective way to give your story juice. Now, one thing I want to point out before I wrap up this video is that whenever you have false friends and false enemies, you can actually have them going back and forth in terms of their allegiances. They can go from being a friend to an enemy and back to a friend and back to an enemy. They can betray your main character, then they can have that moment of uplift, and they can have another betrayal, and so on and so on. And this can be a very effective way of keeping your readers on their toes and keeping them interested in your story and where it's going down the line and how certain events will pay off in the future. One great example of a character who shifts back and forth is Snape from Harry Potter. If you've ever read the series, you know that one minute he looks like the bad guy, then it looks like, he's not so bad, and then it's like, yeah, he's pretty bad, and it's like, no, he's pretty good, and then it's like, no, well, did you see what he did in book 6? And it's like, well, no, what about book 7? And back and forth, and this is what makes his character and the story so interesting, because you never can really put your finger on him and say he's one or the other until the very end of the series. Another example would be Negan from The Walking Dead, who starts off looking like the bad guy to end all bad guys, and then it's like, well, maybe he's kind of reasonable, and then it's like, well, maybe he's actually an ally to Rick, or maybe he isn't, and you don't know which way to go with him, so you're constantly wondering how he's going to factor into the story, where his allegiance lies, what are his motivations, and that makes him and the story more interesting. Now, I have a few more great examples, and these are actually the best ones I came up with for today, and I'd love to share them with you, but if you remember at the start of this video, I did promise that I'd be your enemy by the end of it, and I hate to tell you, but this is it. This is the moment of betrayal, and if you think you're getting any more advice out of me today, you can forget about it. You're on your own. But I guess I'll give you a quick recap of today's video. Anytime you're doing false friends or false enemies, remember that they can add high emotional impact to your stories. If you are going the false friend who turns into an enemy route, remember that these can end up being great villains. And also remember, if you're going the false enemy who becomes a friend route, these can end up becoming cool anti-heroes, but you don't want to overdo it on the villainous part early on, otherwise they'll be too irredeemable. If you want any more information on the subject, check out John Truby's book, The Anatomy of Story. I'll link it in the description below. Question of the day: who is your all-time favorite false enemy, and what is their moment of uplift? Let us know in the comments section below. Thank you guys for watching. Be sure to check out my other videos. Hit the like and subscribe buttons for me. Share this video with a friend if you don't mind. Pick up a copy of Bad Parts if you haven't already. And as always, remember to keep on writing.